Hello, everyone. This is going to be 4.3, the enduring or lasting Constitution. So, let's start with a quote from Ben Franklin, who said, "The Constitution only gives people the right to pursue happiness. You have to catch it yourself." Our objectives: we're going to summarize the arguments both for and against the ratification or passage of this new Constitution by the states. We're going to describe how eventually they decided this Constitution should be ratified. And lastly, we are going to explain the principles of this new Constitution. So, first, let's look at the debate, the fight over passage of this Constitution. Remember, the delegates were there in Philadelphia in 1787 to fix the Articles of Confederation. They were not there to create a whole new set of laws. And so when they stepped out of the Independence Hall in Philadelphia and people heard that we have a brand new government, it kind of caught some states by surprise, partially because this was done in secret. So the delegates now had to get approval or ratification of this new constitution by 9 out of 13 states. And they decided not to go for all 13 because, again, Rhode Island probably was not going to say yes. So they said if 9 out of 13 states say yes to this new constitution, then we'll let it happen. Now, special conventions from each state met to say yes or say no to this new U.S. Constitution. And two groups emerged. We had two groups, one who wanted this Constitution passed and one who did not. The Federalists want it passed. Their opponents, the Anti-Federalists, opposed the ratification of this new U.S. Constitution. Federalists included people like Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. They thought that the old Articles of Confederation were too weak and only a new, stronger federal government would survive and be able to fight against our enemies abroad. And they wanted a much stronger national government. In opposition, Anti-Federalists said they wanted a government that was more like the Articles of Confederation. They were worried that a new federal government would go against the ideals of our new nation and take away our freedoms. They didn't like many things. They didn't like all the power that was going to the new, stronger federal government. They really didn't like that the Constitution did not have a Bill of Rights that specifically enumerated certain freedoms of the people. People who did not like the new Federalist version were people like Sam Adams, John Hancock, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, who had been the person that had called for independence in the first place in the Second Continental Congress, and guys like Patrick Henry, who were very against this sort of larger federal government. They thought it was basically going to turn into a monarchy right away. So here are some Federalist beliefs on one side and the Anti-Federalist belief on the other side. Again, I would pause this real quick to take a look at it. In the end, the Constitution passed because it was supported by George Washington mostly, and also people like Ben Franklin. However, there were people who wrote very persuasive essays about why we should have this new government. Federalists were also very powerful in the cities where the ratifying conventions met, which gave it more chance to be passed. So, here are the places where you see the power of the Federalists, especially along the coasts in the big cities, and the Anti-Federalists were more inland. There were some areas where the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were split over it, and out west they hadn't organized well enough to decide whether to be Federalist or Anti-Federalist. Now, the Federalists made their case in a series of essays called the Federalist Papers. These were written in response to some Anti-Federalist essays which had started to show up in newspapers. And so the Federalists decided we need to respond to this, and they wrote what is called the Federalist Papers. It was written by three of the biggest supporters of the Constitution: Alexander Hamilton of New York, James Madison of Virginia, and John Jay, who is one of our best diplomats of the time. John Jay would also become our first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. These essays in the Federalist Papers argued that we should have a separation of powers, argued for a strong federal government, but also argued that separating powers would keep the federal government from getting too powerful, from creating a monarchy or a dictatorship. It also called for 3 branches of government, again, to sort of divide up the powers a little bit. Hamilton also said we need a strong judiciary. So, in the end, they wrote 85 of these Federalist paper essays. Hamilton ended up doing the bear's work. He did 51 of them, but Madison also did many. John Jay got sick and only wrote 5. So, here is the collection called the Federalist. You'll notice Elizabeth Hamilton. This is from Alexander Hamilton's wife's collection. Now, let's look at the ratifying conventions. 5 states very quickly passed and ratified and accepted this new constitution. Anti-Federalists were worried that this would just be a clean sweep, and so the Anti-Federalists very quickly set up people saying, oh, wait a minute, let's talk about this for a minute. And so they tried to stop ratification in other states. Federalists passed the Constitution in some states by making deals and saying, of course, once we get this new Constitution passed, one of the first things that we're going to do is we're going to set up a couple of amendments to it that establish a Bill of Rights, that establish certain specific rights to be given to the people, and we're going to enumerate and specify these rights. In the end, we got 9 out of 13 states to ratify it, and so this new Constitution was passed. After this new Constitution was passed, the other 4 states pretty quickly decided that they are going to be in on this as well. And so all 13 states said yes to this new Constitution, and we set up the United States with the first capital in New York City as we built a nation's capital. So this is Federal Hall in downtown New York City with the statue of George Washington in front of it. This is where Washington was inaugurated, and if you notice that little dark rectangle up top there, that is the balcony from which he gave the first ever inaugural address. So, pretty quickly after the ratification of the Constitution, as was agreed to, we passed 10 amendments that are called the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights defended individual liberties like the right to bear arms, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to a fair trial. The authors also made sure to include an amendment that said that there were other rights that we weren't specifying as well, so that we wouldn't just look at the Bill of Rights and say, well, I guess those are the only rights that we have. So if you look at it, there are specific rights, and then the 9th one says that there are other rights unmentioned that are being kept by the people, and that powers not mentioned in the Constitution are to be kept by the states or by the people. This was our way of making sure that there were unnamed rights yet to happen. So, constitutional principles. The most important principles of our nation can be found within this Constitution right up to today. It is, very simply, a set of rules of what our federal government can do, and also a lot more of it is what our federal government cannot do. A lot of the things within the Constitution are restrictions of the federal government and some of the powers of the state government as well. Now, one of the most important parts of it is popular sovereignty. This means that the power of the government comes from the people. No government is granted authority by the government itself. The people give the government the rights to rule. It also says that the government has limited powers. This is called limited government. The powers of the federal government are restricted by the Constitution, and that the government cannot do whatever it feels like doing. Also, elected officials are not above the law. Part of the limited government says that if a president needs to be, a president can be impeached. This has happened nearly a few times in our government. It has never successfully happened. It also says that no one person or one branch of government can hold too much power. Power is to be distributed among the different powers within the Constitution. This is the idea of separation of power, that the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch will each have some powers in order to make sure that no one branch can become too powerful. So here's the separation of powers at a glance. Pause it, Take a look at this, take notes on this. This is important. We'll talk about this in class too. Now, federalism, the idea that the federal government has some rights, but the state government has some rights as well, is another important thing. Basically, that power is distributed among the national government and the state government. And it can get a little confusing. So we'll take a look at this as well, that the Supreme Court basically decides which powers go to whom. Does it go to the state government or does it go to the federal government? Each branch of the federal government is set up with powers that are actually meant to block the powers of other branches of the government. So the president has certain powers that can block the power of the Supreme Court or of the Congress, and vice versa. Every branch has certain powers meant to check the power of other branches. This is known as the system of checks and balances. And again, it can get very confusing. I'll set up a thing right here that you can take a look at. And again, pause it, maybe take some notes on this, maybe take a picture of it. But these are the separation of power within the government and the checks and balances of the U.S. government as well. Now, the writers were worried about giving too much power to the people. While we wanted to give power to the people, we also wanted to restrict that power a little bit. They were worried about full-on democracy, the power of the people overtaking the power of the government, that the mob would take over, basically. The people would take over. And so instead, voters would elect the House of Representatives, but they would not elect their senators. The senators would be chosen by the state. And this is the way it happened until the 17th Amendment in 1913. Also, there would be an electoral college that basically the people would not elect the president. They would elect the president indirectly through what's called the electoral college. In general, though, the electoral college follows the will of the people in the state. Now, probably the most important part of this Constitution is that even though we have changed it, we have amended it from time to time when necessary, our Constitution has lived as the founding document of our country since 1789. We have made adjustments throughout the time. We have freed slaves, we had allowed women to vote, we have elected our own senators, and so on and so forth. But in the end, we've only changed it 27 times. It's hard to change the Constitution. We made it that way on purpose. One of the biggest arguments that we have today is how often should we do this? Should the Constitution be changed frequently and whenever we have new ideas about how to make it better? Or should we pretty much leave it alone and only mess with it in times of absolute crisis? That is a question that we still have up through today. Also, is there wiggle room within the Constitution? That's a question we have today, too.